The fluorescent lights hummed above polished linoleum floors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a smell Laura Bennett had learned to breathe without thinking, the way she once learned to breathe through smoke. 3 weeks at Mercy General in Raleigh. 21 days of invisible shifts, careful professionalism, and hands that moved with the kind of precision that nobody questioned because they weren't looking close enough to see it. She wiped down the ER nurse's station at 0600 hours, before the morning rush, her movements efficient and measured, each gesture economical in the way of someone who had learned that wasted motion meant wasted time and wasted time meant people died. The station hummed with that pre-dawn quiet that emergency rooms never truly had, just quieter, like the volume turned down but never off. Monitors beeped in distant trauma bays. Somewhere down the hall, a patient coughed. The coffee maker gurgled its mechanical rhythm. Laura filed charts with the same methodical care she once used to inventory field medical supplies in a forward operating base in Raleigh, checking each name, each note, each vital sign log with the attention of someone trained to catch what others missed. Her hands moved from one chart to the next with no tremor, no hesitation, steady as a surgical laser. She wore civilian scrubs now, navy blue, nothing that marked her as anything other than what she appeared to be, a new nurse who kept her head down and did her work without complaint. But beneath the fabric of her left sleeve, a puckered scar ran across her forearm like a story no one had asked her to tell, a reminder of a life that officially no longer existed. When she reached to file a chart on the top shelf, the sleeve rode up, exposing pale tissue against skin darker than her hands. She pulled it down immediately, a gesture so quick and practiced it was almost invisible. Just habit. Just muscle memory. The ER doors opened and Dr. Marcus Hargrove breezed through like he owned the building, which, in the way that certain men owned the buildings they worked in, he functionally did. His shoes clicked against the tile with the confidence of expensive leather, the kind of sound that made the air pressure change. He was already on his phone, already mid-conversation about a medical supply shipment, already reading something on his tablet that made him smile in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of handsome that came with a price tag, tailored coat, watch that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent, hair that looked like it had been cut that morning. He passed the nurse's station without acknowledging Laura, the way men like him pass service workers without seeing them. Laura noticed him anyway. She noticed everything. What she noticed was that his eyes flicked toward her for exactly 1 second, the kind of assessment a predator makes when deciding if prey is worth the effort. She had felt that look before, in different uniforms, in different contexts. She kept filing charts. A code blue alarm screamed through the ER at 0647, the sound cutting through the morning quiet like artillery fire. Laura's body moved toward it instinctively, the muscle memory older and deeper than her civilian identity, but a senior nurse, Margaret, who had been at Mercy General for 14 years and had the territorial attitude to prove it, waved her off with a sharp gesture. "Stay here. Dr. Hargrove's got this one." The tone said what the words didn't. "You're new, you're still proving yourself, step back." Laura stepped back. She watched through the trauma bay window, her expression neutral, her hand steady as she continued organizing supplies. This was a test too, though Margaret didn't know it. This was always a test. Inside the trauma bay, Hargrove worked with the kind of theatrical efficiency of a surgeon who knew he was being watched. Every movement precise, every decision announced to the team like he was narrating his own movie. Laura watched the equipment log on the wall as a nurse called out items, a 16-gauge central line, 2 units of ONEG blood, a rapid infuser for warm blood products, a portable ultrasound for POCUS confirmation. She watched Hargrove check things off on his tablet afterward, his stylus moving quickly, documentation completed before the patient even left the bay. Something about the numbers didn't align. The ultrasound showed a pericardial effusion, fluid around the heart, that would have required specific drainage. But the log showed 3 large bore needles used. The procedure he performed would have used 1. Maybe 2 if there was any complication. 3 was excessive unless something else was being documented that didn't actually happen. She filed this observation away in the same mental space where she filed everything, patterns, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. The same space where she had learned to track supply discrepancies in a combat field hospital, where every piece of equipment, every drug, every unit of blood was accounted for, because running out of something might mean watching someone you couldn't save. She said nothing. She never said anything unless asked directly, and rarely even then. The morning sun broke through the ER windows at 0712, stretching across the polished floor in bars of light that made the linoleum gleam like water. Hargrove emerged from the trauma bay, his gloves already off, his face already reset into its neutral professional expression. He walked back past the nurse's station, where Laura was now entering data into the electronic medical record system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of speed that only came from someone who had typed reports under stress conditions. He glanced at her, and this time she felt the weight of his gaze for longer than a second. His expression was something between curiosity and dismissal, the expression a man makes when he's trying to decide if someone is worth remembering or worth forgetting. "New hire?" His voice came from behind her, unexpected, a question that wasn't really a question. Laura didn't turn around immediately. She finished entering the vital sign from the chart she was reviewing, pressed enter, then turned in her chair to face him. When she did, her expression was professionally neutral, carefully calibrated to project competence without presumption. 3 weeks, doctor. Started the 20th. And how are you finding Mercy General? He asked this the way someone asks a question they don't actually care about, already moving on mentally while his mouth was still speaking. It's a good hospital, she said. Strong staff. He smiled, the kind of smile that was more about power than warmth. We'll see how long you last. This isn't everyone's speed. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. She understood what he wasn't saying. You look soft, you look like someone who hasn't seen what real medicine looks like, you probably won't make it. The assessment hung in the air between them, casual as a comment about the weather. Laura met his eyes for exactly as long as professionalism required, then turned back to her work. I'll do my best, doctor. I'm sure you will. He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile, the sound diminishing down the hallway toward his office. She heard him on his phone before he even reached it, already deep in conversation about something else, someone else, his attention scattered across a dozen different things the way men with power could afford to scatter their attention. What happened next didn't change anything. The morning continued. Patients arrived, were treated, were discharged or admitted. The ER filled with the organized chaos of a functioning medical facility, nurses calling to doctors, doctors calling for equipment, families waiting in reception areas with that particular kind of anxiety that only a hospital waiting room could produce. Laura moved through it all with the kind of invisible competence that gets noticed only when something goes wrong. She started and on a septic patient that 3 other nurses had attempted and failed, finding a vein in the left hand that everyone else had marked as unusable, sliding the needle in with the kind of confidence that came from having done this in conditions far worse than a well-lit ER. She didn't announce it or explain her technique. She just did it and moved on to the next task. At 1,400 hours, during her lunch break, Laura sat in her car in the parking lot at Mercy General and ate a sandwich she had made that morning from turkey and mustard on whole wheat. She didn't go to the cafeteria. She didn't socialize with the other staff. She sat in the silence of her vehicle and ate, and then she opened the small cardboard box on the passenger seat, the one she had carried into this hospital on day 1. Inside was a pair of worn combat boots, desert tan with creasing at the joints and sand in the laces that she had never fully cleaned out. They were from the 160th SOAR unit, the Night Stalkers, from a deployment that officially never happened, from a place that officially had nothing to do with her, from a life that had been classified and then erased and then buried so deep that the Pentagon had reassigned her with a new social security number and a standing order to never speak of what she had done. She touched the boot once, her fingers running along the scuffed leather, and then she closed the box again. Just a talisman. Just a reminder that the person she had been wasn't gone, just waiting. Quiet. Patient. Ready. She finished her shift at 2,200 hours without incident. Dr. Hargrove didn't speak to her again. He worked through the afternoon in what looked like his normal style, competent but theatrical, decisive but showy, the kind of surgeon who wanted to be seen working. Laura made notes of everything she observed, not because she was planning anything or looking for anything, but because paying attention was a habit older than her civilian identity. She noticed when he called for a medical supply company representative to discuss new equipment contracts. She noticed the man who came was someone Hargrove greeted like an old friend, not like a vendor. She noticed they spoke in his office with the door closed, and when the man left 45 minutes later, he was smiling the kind of smile that men smile when a deal has been made. She noticed all of this and filed it away, the way a nurse with military training filed away information, carefully, methodically, without judgment, waiting to see if it would matter. As she left the hospital at 22:30, walking through the parking lot where rain had begun to fall, she passed a van with Pinnacle Medical Supply printed on its side. She didn't look at it directly. She just noticed it was parked in the doctor's lot, not the vendor lot. Just another inconsistency. Just another piece that didn't fit the picture the hospital was painting. She would have forgotten about it by tomorrow if she had been the person she appeared to be. But she wasn't. 3 days later, Dr. Hargrove called the entire ER staff into the break room during shift change. 23 nurses and techs crowded around the coffee station, their shift bags still slung over shoulders, conversations trailing off as he leaned against the counter with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "I want to make an announcement," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm starting a pool. How long until our newest nurse, nervous Nancy over there, quits and goes back to whatever quiet country clinic she crawled out of?" Laughter rippled through the room like a wave, and heads turned toward Laura. She stood near the back, hand steady as she poured coffee into a chipped mug she'd brought from home 3 weeks ago. The kind of mug that had been through things, a small dent on the rim, a hairline fracture near the base, but still holding liquid, still functional, still here. "I'm giving her 1 week in a real hospital before she runs home crying," Hargrove continued, his smile sharp as a scalpel. "Any takers? Come on, someone must think she'll last 2 weeks. More laughter. Laura added cream to her coffee with the precision of someone measuring medication. 1 measured breath. That's all she allowed herself. Her face remained neutral as limestone, her jaw set at an angle that suggested she'd been carved from something harder than most people expected. She took a single sip of coffee and looked away from the group, focusing instead on the bulletin board behind them where updated hospital protocols were pinned, things most people never bothered reading. What Hargrove didn't know was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had treated sucking chest wounds under mortar fire in Raleigh while rounds came in through the roof. She'd held a 19-year-old Marine's intestines in place with one hand while calling in coordinates with the other. She'd watched blood pool on sand until it looked like an oil slick reflecting the sun, and she'd kept working. The laughter in this break room was nothing. It was static. It was air moving through vocal cords. It was noise made by people who believed that humiliation was a weapon. That afternoon in the cafeteria, Laura carried her tray, wilted salad, coffee, apple, past the doctor's table where Hargrove sat reviewing a chart with his characteristic slouch, the posture of someone who'd never sat straight in his life. As she passed, he rose with the fluidity of a predator and accidentally bumped her arm. The collision was deliberate as surgery. Her tray clattering to the floor sent salad scattering across tile in a pattern that looked almost artful, lettuce fragments catching the overhead light. The cafeteria went quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the ventilation system breathing through the ceiling vents, where fluorescent lights buzzed their monotonous hum. "Oops," Hargrove said flatly, and that single word carried the weight of calculation. He pulled a patient chart from under his arm, a thick one, Timothy Chen's file by the color coding, and dropped it deliberately at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Wouldn't want your sloppy charting to get lost." His smile was a wolf showing its teeth, all surface and no warmth beneath. Laura felt heat rise in her face, felt the exact moment her body wanted to react, wanted to shake, wanted to run. But she'd learned long ago that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the same restraint that kept a sniper from pulling the trigger on a target walking toward a school. It was control masquerading as composure. A single tear escaped. She let it fall without touching her face, without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. The tear traced down her cheek like a fault line, like a crack forming in carefully constructed stone. She wiped it away with deliberate slowness and held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for him to see that she wasn't broken. Just bent. There was a difference. Laura kneeled slowly, gathering scattered papers and letters with movements that looked graceful rather than humiliated. Her hands were steady. They moved like hands that had performed CPR on a 6-year-old in a burning compound 20 years ago, hands that had muscle memory deeper than shame. She picked up each piece of her lunch with the care of someone collecting evidence. "Of course, doctor," she said in a voice like silk over steel, the kind of voice that made the hair on your neck stand up if you were listening carefully. "Wouldn't want anyone to trip." She stood, chart in hand, and walked to the trash can to dispose of her ruined lunch while whispers spread through the cafeteria like contagion. Behind her, Hargrove's smile faltered for just a moment before he returned to his meal, his confidence apparently unshaken. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, Laura stayed late reviewing surgical logs while the hospital settled into the quiet chaos of night shift. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their electric hymn, and the hallway outside her workspace lay empty. She sat in the medical records room with 17 binders stacked in front of her, cross-referencing equipment costs with procedure codes. The discrepancies weren't random mistakes. They were organized. Methodical. The work of someone who understood hospital billing well enough to hide fraud in plain sight. Pericardiocentesis kits billed but never documented in the actual medical records. Cardiac monitoring equipment charged at triple the standard rate, $4,200 for monitoring systems that the national average was running at $1,400. Supply invoices from a company called HMG Medical Solutions that didn't match hospital contracts. She photographed 3 pages with her phone, careful to keep her hand steady, careful not to miss any details. The numbers were adding up to something that looked like fraud. The kind of fraud that could reach into the millions if extended over enough time. She didn't notice Hargrove watching from the hallway window, his jaw tight as a clenched fist, his eyes tracking her fingers as they photographed each page. He stood there for 47 seconds before walking away, and his expression was no longer confident. It was calculating. The expression of a man realizing that his new hire was asking the wrong questions, the kind of questions that could unravel everything he'd built. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 18:47 hours, and the sound was like thunder rolling into the ER, the rubber seals hissing as they parted, boots echoing against tile. Paramedics rushed in a gurney carrying a small figure, and even before Laura heard the vital signs called out, something in her chest tightened. She knew that sound. The sound of a child in distress. The sound of seconds counting down. The boy on the gurney was 9 years old, his eyes closed, truly closed, not in sleep but in the permanent darkness of congenital blindness. His small chest heaved with labored breath. His father, Commander Raymond Chen in Coast Guard dress blues, ran alongside gripping his son's hand with the desperation of a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. Congenital heart defect, developing cardiac tamponade, the lead paramedic shouted over the noise of equipment and alarms. Blood pressure dropping at 12 millimeters per minute, muffled heart sounds, he's circling the drain. Estimated 3 minutes before complete circulatory collapse if we can't decompress the pericardium. Laura moved toward them automatically, her hands already reaching for the crash cart. But Dr. Hargrove intercepted the gurney with the authority of someone who'd practiced this kind of physical dominance. "Get him to trauma 2, call cardiothoracic surgery, we need someone who actually knows what they're doing," he said, his voice carrying the dismissal of a man who'd perfected the art of belittling subordinates. Commander Chen's voice cracked with the weight of every parent's nightmare. "Please, he was fine this morning, then he collapsed at school, I don't understand." Hargrove cut him off without looking at him. "We're doing everything we can, Commander. Please wait in the family area." He was already moving, already in motion, already making this about his expertise rather than Timothy Chen's life. Laura began prepping the crash cart with practiced efficiency, pulling together the equipment they'd need, syringes, monitoring leads, the ultrasound probe. But Hargrove snapped without turning, "Nancy, we don't need you hovering. Go check on the gentleman in bed 6. He's been waiting for 2 hours. The dismissal in his voice was absolute. This was stage 5. Active sabotage. Keeping her away from the patient, keeping her from seeing what he was doing or wasn't doing. She started to protest, but he fixed her with a stare that could have frozen blood in veins. That wasn't a suggestion. From the hallway, Laura watched through the trauma bay window as 3 doctors examined Timothy. She heard fragments: too unstable to move to surgery, need a pediatric cardiac specialist. Dr. Morrison won't be here for at least 90 minutes. The numbers were all wrong. Those numbers were a death sentence dressed in medical language. Timothy's monitor alarm changed pitch. A different tone. A worse tone. Laura checked her watch, the digital display reading 18:53 hours, and calculated the trajectory. With cardiac tamponade this advanced, with pericardial fluid compressing the heart at this rate, the boy had approximately 19 minutes before the fluid completely occluded his ventricular output. 19 minutes was how long she needed to save him, which meant she needed to start now. She looked at her hands. They were steady. They looked like any other nurse's hands, pale from wearing latex gloves 10 hours a day, fingernails cut short for safety, the faint white scar across her knuckles from a training exercise in Ramadi that had gone sideways. But those hands knew things. They remembered things. They'd done things that statistics said weren't possible. Commander Chen sat in the hallway with his head in his hands, his uniform suddenly looking like fabric draped over bone. When he looked up, his eyes met Laura's with the desperate hope of a parent watching his child die in slow motion, a man with rank and authority and connections, but none of it meaning anything because his son was the one circling the drain. She made a decision the way she'd learned to make decisions in her previous life, not with deliberation but with absolute certainty. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just action. Laura walked to the supply room and began gathering equipment with the movements of someone who'd done this before. Pericardiocentesis needle, 18 gauge, the angle and bevel already running through her muscle memory. Ultrasound probe and gel. Sterile field kit. 3-way stopcock. Syringes. The equipment began to stack in her hands like a prayer written in medical supplies. A senior nurse appeared in the doorway, her face a question mark waiting for an answer. "What are you doing?" Dr. Hargrove said. Laura's voice was quiet and absolute, the kind of calm that only came from having already survived the worst. "That child will be dead in 14 minutes if we wait for cardiothoracic surgery. Are you going to help me or stop me?" The nurse hesitated, her career in the balance against a child's life. Then she stepped aside. The ambulance bay doors burst open like a gunshot and paramedics flooded through, wheeling a stretcher with a boy no older than 9. His small frame was swallowed by the adult-sized monitors strapped to his chest. His eyes were closed, not sleeping, Laura noticed. Sightless. The paramedic's voice cut through the organized chaos. "Timothy Chen, 9 years old, congenital cardiac defect, rapid decompensation en route. We got an EKG showing signs of pericardial effusion. His oxygen saturation's been dropping steadily. Started at 94%, now we're at 78 and falling." Commander Chen appeared behind the stretcher, his uniform sharp as a blade, his face the color of old concrete. A Coast Guard officer with the bearing of someone accustomed to command now stripped entirely of control. He reached for his son's hand as they moved through the bay, and his mouth opened to speak, but the paramedics were already transferring Timothy to the trauma bed with the kind of coordinated precision that only came from 100 previous transfers, 100 other children, 100 other desperate parents. Dr. Hargrove materialized from trauma bay 1 before Timothy's stretcher had fully settled. He didn't walk, he descended, his presence announcing itself like a thunderstorm rolling across open water. He pulled the EKG strip from the machine and his eyes moved across it with the efficiency of someone reading a menu he'd memorized years ago. "Get me a full cardiac panel. Stat echocardiogram. I want blood pressure readings every 2 minutes." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that made nurses move faster and residents straighten their spines. Laura stood at the medication cart, watching. Waiting. She'd seen the initial vitals as the paramedics handed off, oxygen saturation at 78%, heart rate at 147, blood pressure dropping like a stone in deep water. The paramedic had said pericardial effusion, and that meant fluid. Fluid around the heart, crushing it, suffocating it. Timothy's small lips were already edging toward blue. 2 other residents entered the trauma bay behind Hargrove. One was Dr. Mitchell, who'd been at Mercy General for 5 years and carried himself with the cautious confidence of someone who knew his own limitations. The other was Dr. Patel, younger, sharper, but still learning the rhythm of crisis management. They both studied Timothy's small body with the same expression, concern mixed with something else. Something that looked like uncertainty. Hargrove leaned over the boy, his stethoscope moving across the small chest in practice movements. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sterile white that made Timothy's skin look translucent. Hargrove straightened, handed the stethoscope to Mitchell, who repeated the examination. Then Patel. The 3 of them moved like dancers who trained together but were no longer quite in sync. Fluid around the heart, definitely, Hargrove said, his voice taking on that particular tone Laura had learned to recognize, the one that meant he'd already made his decision. The echo will confirm the volume, but we're looking at significant pericardial effusion. This child needs a pericardiocentesis, but not here. Not now. Commander Chen stepped forward, his uniform jacket suddenly too large for his frame. What do you mean, not now? He's extremely unstable, Hargrove said, not unkindly. The cruelty in him was always careful, always calibrated. Moving him, attempting an invasive procedure in this state, the risk of cardiac arrest is too high. We need to stabilize him first. I'm calling for a pediatric cardiothoracic specialist from Duke. They have a surgical suite equipped for these kinds of complex cases. ETA is 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Laura did the math in her head the way she'd learned to do math under fire in Ramadi, not with a calculator, but with the cold certainty that came from training and experience and the knowledge that numbers meant lives. Timothy's oxygen saturation was at 78 and dropping. His heart rate was compensating, trying to push blood through a system that was being strangled by fluid. At this rate of decline, factoring in the already compromised cardiac function from the congenital defect, the decreasing oxygen delivery to his brain and organs. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Laura moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check with the resident or wait for Hargrove's blessing. She simply turned toward the supply closet where they kept the portable ultrasound machines, and her feet carried her there with the kind of certainty that came from having made these exact same decisions in a field hospital outside of Fallujah with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. The ultrasound machine was the kind designed for trauma bays, compact, fast, reliable. She wheeled it toward Trauma Bay 2 where Timothy lay, his small chest rising and falling too quickly, his fingers curling into unconscious fists against the stretcher rails. The monitor above his head beeped out a rhythm that was all wrong, too fast, too irregular, too desperate. "What the hell are you doing?" Hargrove's voice came from behind her, and it carried the particular edge of someone who was watching his authority be questioned in real time. Laura didn't answer. She positioned the probe over Timothy's chest, her hands moving through the sequence her muscle memory had encoded over 13 years of service in 3 different combat zones. She'd done this in sandstorms. She'd done this in the dark. She'd done this with a flashlight held between a medic's teeth and nothing but the sound of incoming mortars to mark time. The probe moved across the boy's small sternum, angling to capture the pericardial space. The screen lit up with the image she'd already known she'd find. A massive collection of fluid, straw-colored, clear but enormous, was compressing Timothy's heart like a fist closing around something fragile. The fluid had crowded into the pericardial sac, and Timothy's heart was trying to pump through it like a boxer fighting with weights tied to his wrists. "He needs the procedure now," Laura said. Her voice was steady, level, the kind of calm that only came from having already survived worse. "Not in 90 minutes. Now." His O2 sat is 74. His blood pressure's dropping. The fluid is tamponading his heart. He has maybe 20 minutes before this becomes a code. Hargrove stepped between her and the patient. His presence filled the space like something physical, like a wall made of ego and institutional power and the absolute certainty that he was the only person in the room qualified to make decisions about life and death. You are a floor nurse. You don't perform procedures. You don't make those calls. Get out of my trauma bay. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Commander Chen appeared in the doorway, his uniform somehow more impressive now that he was frightened. If she can help my son? She can't, Hargrove snapped, and the words came out like a whip. She's going to kill him trying to play doctor. Security. But Laura had already moved. The radio on Hargrove's belt crackled with a response that was still 20 seconds away, and she had calculated that gap with the precision of someone who understood that seconds were currency in trauma. Her hands moved on their own, prepping the site with betadine, draping the sterile field with the speed and efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times in her mind and 50 times in reality. The needle was already in her hand, the 14-gauge angiocath, the size that would allow her to access the pericardial space and drain the fluid that was suffocating Timothy's heart. She advanced it under ultrasound guidance, watching the needle on the screen as it moved through skin and tissue and pericardium. The ultrasound probe in her left hand held steady like it was anchored to bedrock, while her right hand guided the needle with the precision that came from having learned medicine in a place where there was no margin for error because error meant body bags. The needle entered the pericardial space and she drew back the syringe. Straw-colored fluid filled the chamber, 50 milliliters, then 100, then 150. Timothy's oxygen saturation climbed as the pressure around his heart released. 94, 96. The monitor's beep smoothed from that desperate irregular rhythm into something closer to a sinus rhythm, still fast, still compensatory, but no longer the sound of a child drowning in his own body. The trauma bay went silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the hiss of oxygen flowing through the nasal cannula. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. Then Hargrove's voice came low and venomous, "You just ended your career." He pulled out his phone and walked into the hallway, and Laura could hear fragments of his voice. "Unauthorized procedure, check her credentials thoroughly. I want her references verified tonight." Each word was a hammer blow, each sentence a carefully constructed assault. This wasn't anger. This was strategy. This was a man who'd just been challenged and was now going to dismantle the challenger with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which systems to manipulate. Commander Chen gripped Laura's arm, and his hand was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. "You saved his life." She looked at Timothy's peaceful face, the small features relaxed now that the pressure around his heart had released, his breathing steadying, his color returning from that terrible blue-tinged white to something approximating healthy. She allowed herself one moment of relief, just one, before the wall started closing in. Within 30 minutes, Hargrove returned with 2 hospital board members and the risk management director. The director's name was Patterson, and he carried a tablet and the expression of someone tasked with managing liability. "We need to see all of your credentials, certifications, and employment history," he said, his voice polite in that institutional way that made everything sound like it was being conducted from behind bulletproof glass. "We're calling your previous employers listed on your application." Laura's face went carefully blank because she knew exactly what was about to happen. The phone number she'd listed for her previous positions didn't lead to hospitals. They led to disconnected lines. They led to voicemail boxes that had been disconnected years ago. They led to nothing because the military had erased her after Ramadi. After the hostage extraction had gone sideways. After she'd held a baby, Timothy's baby self, in her arms while gunfire stitched patterns through the compound walls around them. After she'd been ordered to vanish and told that officially, legally, and in every database that mattered, Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had never existed. "I can explain," she began, but Hargrove's smile was already spreading across his face like something blooming in the dark, triumphant and terrible. "I'm sure you'll try," he said. Dr. Hargrove stormed into trauma too like a man whose world was collapsing, which it was, though he didn't know it yet. His face had gone the color of old bruises. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking at the edges like cheap glass. Laura didn't look up from the ultrasound monitor where Timothy's pericardial sac was already visibly smaller, the fluid draining, the boy's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 75 to 82. The heart monitor's beep had steadied into something almost musical. "Saving his life, Doctor," she said quietly. That was the moment Hargrove understood she wasn't the person he'd been tormenting. She was something else entirely. Something that didn't break. Within an hour, his panic had crystallized into something far more dangerous: strategy. He didn't raise his voice again. Instead, he made calls. 3 of them, each one a knife being positioned carefully. The hospital's chief medical officer picked up on the first ring, a man named Bradford who owed Hargrove a favor from a shared investment in a private urgent care clinic in Durham. Then came the call to the board chairman's office, delivered with the kind of trembling concern that suggested he was doing everyone a favor by reporting a potential credentialing fraud. Finally, he contacted risk management directly, his voice modulated to sound almost protective. "I'm worried about patient safety," he said. "This nurse performed a procedure without authorization. I need to know who approved her credentials because clearly something slipped through." It was brilliant, really. He wasn't attacking her directly anymore. He was using the hospital's own machinery against her, and the machine, once set in motion, was unstoppable. By 1600 hours, risk management had already started pulling records. By 1700, they'd discovered the first problem. By 1800, they'd discovered the second. And by 1900, Laura sat in a windowless office on the 3rd floor across from the hospital administrator, 2 board members, and risk management director Patricia Covington, a woman whose eyes had the flat intensity of someone trained to detect lies. The smell of burnt coffee and old carpet filled the space, the kind of room where bad news came to live. "Your previous employer," Covington began, sliding a printout across the desk. "St. Jude's Medical Center in San Diego. We called the number you provided on your application. It's been disconnected for 3 years." Laura's hands rested flat on the table. "Steady. The hospital where you claim to have worked for 6 years has no record of a Laura Bennett in their personnel database," another board member added, glancing at his tablet. "Not in any capacity. Not as staff, not as per diem, not as anything." Covington leaned forward. "Your nursing school confirms you graduated with honors in 2014, but when we requested they verify your clinical experience, they refused to provide any documentation beyond the diploma itself. Their exact words were that information is restricted." The administrator, a man named Patterson with the soft voice of someone accustomed to firing people, placed his hands together. "Laura, we're required by Joint Commission standards to suspend you immediately pending full investigation. Can you provide any documentation? Educational records, employment verification, references who can speak to your clinical background." Laura thought of the storage unit in Chapel Hill where her Navy Cross sat in a waterproof case next to a DD-214 that classified her service as honorable but every significant detail redacted. She thought of the safety deposit box she couldn't access without triggering FBI alerts on accounts that officially belonged to a woman who'd been declared killed in action in 2018. She thought of the classified files that listed Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett as deceased, her body never recovered, her sacrifice sealed away in Pentagon databases that would remain locked for another 32 years. "I can't provide what you're asking for," she said, her voice like stone over deeper stone. Hargrove, who'd been silent until this moment, stepped forward from where he'd been standing by the window like a man waiting for his moment. His face had arranged itself into an expression of profound sadness. "It's such a shame," he said, almost gently. "We really wanted to believe in you, Nancy." The use of the wrong name was deliberate. A small cruelty meant to signal that she'd never mattered to him at all, that she was interchangeable, disposable, a narrative he could write and rewrite as needed. By 21:45 hours, the same security guard who'd smiled at her that morning, a kind man named Derek who had 2 daughters and always held the ER doors open, walked her to her locker. His jaw was tight. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Laura opened the locker door and looked at the thin collection of objects that represented her civilian life. The cracked ceramic mug she'd rescued from the break room dumpster, white with a faded navy anchor on the side. The small succulent plant she'd bought at the grocery store 3 months ago, its leaves shriveled and brown despite her best efforts to nurture something living. A photograph in a cheap plastic frame showing her unit in Raleigh, 12 faces smiling at the camera in front of a Humvee. Martina's in the back row, he'd bled out in her arms on a Tuesday. Chen in the front left, she'd carried him as a 6-month-old out of a burning compound. 3 others were gone now too. The photograph was like holding a ghost. And beneath it all, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag at the bottom, the pair of worn combat boots she'd kept hidden since the day she arrived. Desert tan, the leather cracked and stained, the laces still tied in a double knot from the last time she'd taken them off in a forward operating base medical tent 7 years ago. She packed them into a cardboard box that Derek provided, her movements efficient and without hesitation. The box felt light in her hands, which meant everything that mattered to her in Raleigh fit in something you could carry with one arm. The rain started as she reached the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, fat drops that fell with the weight of bullets. Laura set the cardboard box on a wet bench and pulled her thin jacket tighter. The boots inside the box were probably ruined now, the delicate remaining leather absorbing water, but it didn't matter. They'd survived worse. She'd survived worse. She looked at the photograph one more time, the 12 faces of people who depended on her when everything was fire and blood and the sound of rounds coming through walls. Corporal Martinez had screamed her name as the infection spread through his leg. She'd held him down as she cut away the dead tissue because there was no morphine left, and sometimes love meant you had to be cruel. Lieutenant Chen had been 6 months old, an infant born in a combat zone to parents who were trying to keep him alive. She'd carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with shrapnel in her shoulder and thigh and ribs because the alternative was leaving him to burn. The call sign they'd given her, Rabbit, had come from how fast she moved under fire, how she'd learned to think faster than the sound of explosions. She wiped her face but couldn't tell anymore if it was rain or tears, and then she didn't try to distinguish between them anymore. The bus pulled up through the downpour, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights across a hostile horizon. Laura picked up the cardboard box, climbed aboard, and didn't look back at Mercy General, didn't think about Hargrove or the administrator or the risk management director. She thought about the pericardiocentesis she'd performed with hands that moved on their own, the needle sliding past the pericardium, the hiss of fluid releasing, the boy's oxygen climbing toward survival. She'd done her job. She'd saved the child. Everything after that was just noise. 3 days later, Morrison's diner smelled like grease and broken dreams and the particular kind of coffee that had been sitting in a pot since 4 a.m. Laura moved between tables in her polyester uniform, a pale blue thing with a name tag that read Nancy because she couldn't bring herself to give her real name to the manager, a burnt-out woman named Sheila who paid minimum wage and didn't ask questions. She was wiping down table 7 when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something in her nervous system, the part that had kept her alive in Raleigh, the part that still heard explosions in car backfires, made her pick up. Is this Laura Bennett? A man's voice. Official. Controlled. The kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to command. Her hands went still on the dish rag. This is Commander Marcus Chen, United States Coast Guard. I need you to listen very carefully. My son Timothy is in Mercy General's ICU. He's stable but he's panicking, he won't calm down. The medical staff says his vital signs are deteriorating from anxiety. He keeps asking for someone. He keeps saying a name. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She'd tried not to think about the boy since the rain at the bus stop, tried to convince herself that he was someone else's responsibility now. He keeps saying a word over and over, Commander Chen continued, his voice beginning to fracture slightly. He says Drabbit. Nurse, my son is blind. He's never seen your face. I don't know how he knows that name. But he won't stop asking for you, and Laura ended the call and was already moving toward the employee break room where she kept her jacket. 20 minutes later, she walked through the automatic doors of Mercy General's ICU and found her path blocked by Nursing Supervisor Williams, a heavy-set woman with arms like tree limbs. "You're not clear to be here," Williams began, but a man in a Navy uniform, service dress blues with the silver collar devices of a flag officer, appeared at her shoulder. "She goes where I tell her to go," Commander Chen said, and Williams stepped aside because when someone sounds like that, you obey. Laura moved past them both without speaking, her diner uniform still damp from the evening rain, and pushed open the door to Timothy's room. The ICU was where second chances lived. Laura knew this now, standing in the doorway of Timothy Chen's room, her diner uniform still damp from the evening rain, watching the boy who'd asked for her by a name nobody alive outside classified files should know. His vital signs scrolled across the monitor, heart rate elevated, oxygen saturation creeping downward, but his body was stable. His agitation was something else entirely. Something that belonged to a 9-year-old who'd been carrying a memory for 2 decades without knowing it was a memory at all. Commander Chen stood when she entered, his jaw tight with something between relief and disbelief. The ICU nurse who'd been soothing Timothy's anxiety stepped back without being asked. People responded to urgency in Laura's movements the way water responds to gravity. They simply moved. "He keeps asking for you," Commander Chen said quietly. "Calling you by a name we've never heard him say before. He was stable an hour ago, then suddenly agitated, asking for a nurse named Rabbit. We ran through every staff list. No one named Rabbit works here." Then I remembered something. He stopped himself. "Will you just talk to him?" Laura moved to the bedside. Timothy's sightless eyes turned toward her with the precision of someone using sound as a map, locating her by the whisper of her shoes on linoleum, the shift in air pressure when another body entered his space. His small hand reached across the bed rail. She took it. His fingers were thin, trembling slightly, and his grip was fierce. "Rabbit," he whispered. "You came back." The words landed like shrapnel. Not metaphorically. Actually. Laura felt them embed in her sternum and stay there, fragments she'd carry until she died. She'd held this boy once before, not as a 9-year-old ICU patient, but as an infant, pulled from a burning compound in Raleigh while mortars walked across rooftops like angry gods. She'd kept him alive in her arms for 47 minutes until the medevac touched down. She'd never known his name. Classified extraction. Operation burned. Names erased. She'd spent 20 years not knowing if he'd survived. "I'm here," Laura said. Her voice came out steady because Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had learned long ago that your voice was the first thing they took when they broke you, so you held it like a secret. "I'm right here." Commander Chen's face shifted, the recognition hitting him like a physical force. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands and opened a file, scrolling through words that couldn't exist, that he shouldn't have access to, that were stamped across the top in letters so red they seemed to bleed into the screen. "This can't be," he said, reading aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. "Navy Cross. 2 silver stars." His voice dropped. 3 bronze stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Credited with saving 47 lives under fire. Credited with saving, he looked at his son, then back to the file. Credited with saving me when I was 6 months old. The phone nearly slipped from his hands. Laura didn't move. Didn't flinch. The monitor above Timothy's head continued its steady beeping, a rhythm like a helicopter blade turning, like time keeping its own count. She held the boy's hand while his father processed what his clearance level had finally revealed. The invisible woman in the diner uniform, the one they'd fired without ceremony, was the ghost they'd all been searching for. The ICU doors opened and a Coast Guard officer entered, captain's insignia, uniform pressed like a blade, boots polished to a mirror finish. Behind him came the same security guard who'd walked Laura out into the rain 3 days ago. The guard carried her cardboard box. The one with the cracked mug, the succulent, the photo of her unit, and her combat boots laid in tissue paper like casualties waiting for transport. The captain stepped forward and extended his hand to Laura. "Senior Chief Bennett. I'm Captain Williams, Maritime Safety and Security Team. Your file has been reopened at the highest levels." His voice carried the weight of institutional machinery finally shifting toward accountability. "I have your personnel reinstatement here, your full medal documentation, and orders from USCG Command to escort you to active reserve status with full honors." He paused. "Your team has been notified you're alive." Dr. Hargrove chose that exact moment to walk past the ICU window. She saw him through the reinforced glass, saw the moment his brain processed the captain's uniform, saw him stop mid-stride like a man who'd just felt the ground collapse beneath him. He looked small. That was the strangest part. Laura had been terrified of him 3 days ago. Now he looked like a man watching his own funeral happen in real time. The security guard approached Hargrove with the casual precision of someone executing a task he'd executed before. He was good at his job. His job, right now, was moving Dr. Hargrove toward the exit. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," the guard said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was the kind of statement that erased options. Hargrove moved like a man underwater, like someone whose last bargaining chip had just been called and found counterfeit. Nobody watched him go because the entire floor's attention had collapsed inward toward the ICU, toward the invisible nurse who'd materialized into something they didn't have words for yet. 6 months later, Laura Bennett sat in her new office, the one with her name on the door, the one that said Head of Emergency Medicine, the one that meant something beyond a title. It meant power. It meant authority. It meant nobody would ever ask her to pick up a drop chart again. She arranged her cracked mug on the desk beside the succulent, which had transformed into something thriving and green, its leaves full of water and attention. Outside her window, the parking lot sprawled beneath morning sun. She could see the spot where someone had set up a folding table, a man sitting behind it with stacks of pamphlets. Supplemental insurance policies. His medical license had been revoked for months ago. The fraud charges had stuck. The criminal investigation was still ongoing. Medicare was seeking restitution of $1.3 million, which Hargrove would spend the rest of his life paying back through garnished wages and asset liquidation. Sometimes Laura saw him through the hospital's front windows, sitting at that folding table like a man selling pennants. The insurance policies were his only income now. Colleagues didn't stop by. The country club had revoked his membership. His ex-wife's lawyers were still filing paperwork. He'd been fired from 2 supplemental positions after his history became public. The irony was so sharp it could cut. A man who'd inflated equipment costs and phantom procedures was now selling supplemental coverage to people trying to afford actual care. Laura's phone buzzed. A message from Timothy Chen, "We brought you something." She stood and moved to the window, watching Commander Chen and his son emerge from the hospital entrance. Timothy held a white cane, moving with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to navigate the world through sound and touch. His father carried a wrapped package. By the time they reached her office, Laura had her emotions locked down like a surgical field. Steady. Professional. Ready. Timothy's fingers found the edge of her desk as Commander Chen unwrapped the package. Inside, her combat boots. Not the worn pair in her cardboard box. These were polished to a mirror shine, mounted on a wooden plaque with a brass plate engraved in letters so precise they looked machined. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, USN, Rabbit, 47 souls. "I keep the originals in my room," Timothy said. "But Dad said you should have these for your office. So you remember." So they remember. Laura's hands were steady as she took the plaque. Her voice, when she spoke, came out the way it always did now, with the clarity of someone who'd learned that silence was a weapon and words were mercy, and sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was speak the truth plainly, without decoration, without apology. "Thank you," she said. "This means everything." She hung the plaque beside her unit photograph, the one showing a squad of warriors in desert tan, half of them now dead, all of them now part of her visible history instead of classified ghosts. Commander Chen's hand found her shoulder, a gesture that meant more than words could carry. His son couldn't see her tears, but he could hear the thickness in her breathing, and that was enough. That afternoon, Laura conducted her first staff meeting as department head. 23 faces looked up at her, some of them the same ones who'd laughed at Hargrove's bet about her quitting within a week, who'd watched him humiliate her, who'd seen her fired without ceremony. She stood at the front of the conference room and waited for silence. The silence came fast. Muscle memory. They knew who was in charge now. "You all know my story now," Laura said quietly. "What matters going forward is this: every patient who comes through those doors gets our absolute best, our complete integrity, and our unwavering competence. No exceptions. No shortcuts. No ghosts." She paused, looking out the window toward the parking lot where an empty folding table caught the afternoon sun. "We carry stethoscopes, not guns. But make no mistake, we're still warriors." A code blue sounded overhead. Laura moved toward it with the speed of someone who'd been training for this her entire life, her team falling into formation behind her. The ER doors opened before she reached them. The trauma bay lit up like a battlefield she knew how to navigate. Her hands moved with the precision that came from 20 years of holding lives together when everything was burning. Oxygen readings. Medication timing. Every decision crystalline and perfect and certain. As her team worked around her, Laura heard the monitor climbing: 72, 85, 91. Sinus rhythm. The patient had a second chance. Everyone in that room had a second chance, because now they knew what was possible when you stopped hiring people and started listening to them, when you chose integrity over institutional protection, when you built systems that rewarded competence instead of concealing fraud. The patient stabilized. The room exhaled. And on the wall behind the nurse's station, someone had hung a small handwritten sign during Laura's meeting: Rabbit's rules. 1. Patient first. 2. Chart everything. 3. Never surrender. She'd never written those rules. But they were hers anyway. If you've made it this far, thank you, and not just for watching, but for caring about the people who work in silence. Subscribe for more stories about the ones we almost missed, and drop a comment: who's the invisible warrior in your life that nobody knows about? What would you do if you discovered your colleague was someone legendary?